Great. Thank you very much, Shannon, and welcome everybody. Delightful to see everybody as we click over into the afternoon. I think at high noon, 12 noon. I hope everyone's Monday is going well. Very nice to see you all. Let me start, first of all, by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the eastern suburbs of Sydney, just up the road from Coogee, on Gadigal land, part of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and rising. And perhaps I could do that on behalf of all of us, as we are, I'm sure, dispersed all over the country. Certainly for those of us who are joining from Australia, we'd very much like to make that acknowledgement on your behalf as well as we start our conversation. My role today very much will be to get out of the way as quickly as possible and get our guest speakers to start talking about this very, very timely conversation about regulating in the digital world and the skills and capabilities for regulators and the regulatory function. Just a quick background, I've spent a large chunk of my life in and amongst, I suppose, three sort of major areas, so policy work and policy work in Canberra and in Sydney, both at the political and bureaucratic level, a lot of work in the public management space, and more recently, including a stint with Cisco in the digital space. So very happy to be at the intersection of all of those things as we get a conversation quite timely, in my view, about what's happening to the regulatory function and the work of regulators as we engage the digital world. Let me just talk quickly about the seminar and arrangements, just to make sure we've got all of those in place and everyone's clear. We're going to be recording the seminar today, and the video link will be made available on the NRCoP communication channel. That's obviously through ANSOG's community practice. We'll also be utilising the Q&A function in Zoom for questions on our speakers, which we very much encourage you to start logging as soon as you're ready. We've left a good amount of time in the run sheet to make sure we've got plenty of time to try and cover as many as we can. You can go in and put questions in. You can upvote. I'm sure you're all deeply familiar with this technology these days, so we can have a good look at where people are beginning to focus their attention in terms of what they'd like our guests to be speaking about. We'll try and get through as many, as I say, as we can. If by some chance the live stream does cut out, don't move, don't panic. The NRCoP team will be working in the background to rectify the situation as much as possible. And if your internet connectivity drops out, I guess you could restart, or you could ring Telstra, or you could ring Malcolm Turnbull. Who knows? Anyone who thinks you can get you back on a good internet connection. Hopefully that won't happen. It's really a very vital conversation that we're having, regulating in a digital world, a focus on skills and capabilities. We're going to explore ways in which regulators can build the necessary confidence and skills in the use of new digital tools, platforms, and capability. I think the reality for many people, I'm sure, on this call will be that we know that the technology and regulation have had a very, very long-standing relationship, not always very easy relationship, but nonetheless a very, very powerful relationship. And we're very much in the moment, particularly, I think, fired up by the last year or two of this astonishing explosion of interest and engagement with this current wave of the AI revolution. I think we're in a very particularly interesting moment as we consider what it is about that new set of capabilities that needs itself to be regulated. As you know, the conversation about how on earth we do that with a set of tools and technologies that are developing as rapidly and as explosively as AI is exercising a lot of people around the world, including in this country. But also what it is about that world that brings new tools and capabilities to the regulatory function in the first place. What is it that regulators need to be able to harness and engage with those new tools and techniques in order for them to be more effective as regulators? That's kind of where we're going to go today. Let me briefly introduce our two speakers in the order we'll start anyway, but as far as possible, I hope we'll have the conversation as free-flowing as we can. Dr. Kate Conroy works in AI safety and assurance for the Queensland Government, and she's also a specialist capability officer around responsible AI for the Royal Australian Air Force. She's a lead co-author, and I think many people on this call, I think anyway, will have come across this now, the National Framework for the Assurance of Artificial Intelligence in Government, which is very recent, came out of some early work in New South Wales, and as chief scientist for the Trusted Autonomous Systems Defence Cooperative Research Centre, which is quite a mouthful, She has led the delivery of Robotics and Autonomous Systems Gateway, a digital hub providing access to resources and tools to support the Australian autonomous systems ecosystem. It's quite a background, and frankly, it's a very short paragraph of a very, very long CV, which we won't go into any further, but somebody who's clearly been working in this space for a while, and particularly at the cutting edge. Joshua Saunders is joining us from the Federal Department, the Australian Department of Finance, an economist with 20 years experience across the APS, including a short period in the Parliament of Victoria down in Melbourne. In that time, he's worked across several portfolios, telecommunications, competition policy, other areas like water markets, national security. And in fact, at the moment, his substantive role in the Department of Finance is as the Director of the Economic Integration and Security function within finance, which is a fascinating interface in itself. But he also, just for fun, is looking after a lot of the work in finance at the moment around digital regulation, which is why he's with us today. He's the chair, too, of the Canberra Security Economics Network, as I say, exploring, I think, a fascinating domain as we are all beginning to learn about the way in which digital technologies are engaging the sort of fusion of our economic policy and our security policy. But anyway, that indeed may be another piece of work we'll save for another day. I'm going to ask each of our guests, and Kate, I'll start with you for sort of 4 or 5 minutes, just a kind of some opening reflections. And I wonder how at the moment, as we sit here ticking over as we are just about to into August, in the second half of the year, here in 2024. How do you summarize perhaps some of the opportunities and risks at the moment for regulators from the digital world right now? And what do you think it's particularly challenging for regulators that perhaps those emerging from this world? Over to you anyway for a few minutes. Really great to see you.
Thank you so much. That lovely introduction, Martin. And I know that you had a critical role in that New South Wales AI assurance framework, which has been world leading and leading our way in Australia. So thanks for that. So risks and opportunities. I'll start at a sort of societal level, I think. Something that is an opportunity for Australia. I'm going to start with an opportunity. Why get down from the start? So Australia is a really remarkable nation in terms of regulatory leadership. We have a great history in this, actually. Sometimes people say we're slow to come up with regulation, or we follow other countries. You know, we're waiting to see what others do. We're waiting to see what the EU does on AI. You know, we're not being the first one out of the gate. But sometimes we are the first out of the gate. And this is not a cultural, you know, it's not a monotone. So CASA, for example, released the first drone regulation in the early 2000s that put us ahead on remote operations. I'm obviously going to be a bit on the robotics sector because I know probably more about that than some other places. But, you know, some of the regulatory allowances for autonomous trucks in the mining industry has enabled economic productivity that Australia is a world leader in. So I'm sort of going to start to say, look, culturally, we also punch way above our weight in standards and in other kinds of thought leadership. And so, for example, in beyond visual line of sight regulation, Australia plays at an international leadership level as well. And some of our leadership in that space has come to Australia to start their own businesses in Australia and to take their intellectual leadership in regulating drone operations in complex traffic environments, and then seeing how we actually build technologies that take advantage of that thought leadership in a regulatory space. So I think the opportunity for us in Australia is to recognise our history and to grab onto that actual ability to be innovative culturally. Some people think that you can't get an exemption in order to use new and innovative technology with the regulators, and they just don't know the regulators well enough to realise that, for example, AMSA and CASA do have regulatory pathways for new and emerging technologies. You simply actually have to know that that's a pathway available in order to take advantage of it. Okay, so I think opportunities are really there, and I think we need to sell our story better. Robotics and Autonomous Systems Gateway, rasgateway.com.au, that's RAS Gateway. I recommend it because it's a government-sponsored site. So the Queensland State Government wanted to invest in the assurance of autonomy, and it is a repository of an incredible amount of information about the state of autonomous systems regulation in air, maritime and land domains. And it indicates just some of the information I was telling you about with the opportunities, and provides us a grounding to move forward. Okay, risks, quite a few. I don't want to take up too much time, but so let me just divide them, I think, in the risks there are risks in why we regulate, what we regulate, and how we regulate.
Mm-hmm.
So those are my three broader level categories under which I'd like the discussion to flow. And I'll just give an example in this opening remarks to think about. So when I think about why regulate, I look at our society and I look at who's in charge, who's got power. And so things like books like The Political Philosophy of AI are good resources, because what that does is it puts you in an understanding about who's making decisions about the use of AI and digital platforms, and who has any power to intervene on them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really good book called Cloud Empires as well, and it's about the power of online platforms to pretty much do whatever they want, and how inept or impotent we are to affect what they're doing. So when we ask why regulate, I think we need to understand what our roles are in society, in particular for regulators as part of the technocracy. So being part of the technocracy in a democracy. So often public servants who are not elected into their roles in government, but are given the power to make rules to affect what people are allowed to do in the public. And some people like that. They think that's important. And other people are like, I don't want so much regulation. I would like to be able to run my business or do my things in my own way. And in fact, if I have to be compliant with Australian regulation on stuff, then these international players like Meta, they kind of run ramshot over us in the digital environment in Australia. They do whatever they want and we get penalised. And so for the COVID app, when we had that COVID contract tracing app, where the federal government invested in it in the, early 2020, there was a lot of effort, and boy, it moved quickly, and gosh, it was launched like within seconds for government. It was amazing. And Apple and Google got together and were like, we don't care about Australia. We have data and we know everyone in Australia is dependent on us, so we don't really care what the Australian government thinks is a good idea. So for me, the power conversation is a critical starting point in regulation, because we can't really have opinions that are meaningful if we're not realistic about how much power we have. What to regulate? Is it teraflops? Is it spectrum? Physical stuff? Microchips? Who? People? Organizations? What are we going to regulate? And then how do we regulate is, of course, the final part. What are the mechanisms that would be effective? And is regulation the right approach to control, influence, and power to get the effect we want, which is presumably like a safer population and other things that regulators hope to achieve? That's me.
Super. Well, that'll start us off with some nice big issues to start with. We'll chew on those a bit further. But Joshua, why don't I bring you in at this point? I know a long background in this space, but from a slightly different perspective, particularly as an economic policy maker and analyst. Where would you take us as a quick summary of where you think we are at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and some great opening remarks, Kate, which I can segue nicely from. I think there's a couple of things that are worth thinking about and framing this conversation. I think one of them is about Australia's position in the world. Australia is a small, open economy. We don't have a lot of technology vendors, for example, and I know that, Kate, you mentioned Apple and Google. And I actually think that's a perfect framing device for the types of issues that I think we should be engaging in. And that is, what is the Australian government's role? What are regulators' roles? What are society's roles? But I think probably the most important bit to that is, what can we meaningfully do? And I think to the question on what can Australia do, I think it's an interesting one, because we are deployers of technology, often not developers. That doesn't mean we don't develop technology. But for something like AI, which is the contemporary issue, we are deployers of very large multinational companies' technology, which can frame and change the way that we think about the issue. But I'll segue into an issue that's close to my heart personally, and something that I deal with in my job, and that is, how can we use these conversations around regulatory technology, around the deployment of technologies that can be construed as high risk or could be used as in an area that is of high risk, to engage with our nearest neighbours, engage in the global conversation around what sort of a world do we want to live in, and how do we want these things to deploy? The fact of the matter is, we can't control probably 90% of what is going to happen with some of these technologies. That doesn't mean we have no control at all. It means we just have to exercise our control slightly differently. And I look back to something that looks like it's a far distance away, but it's a nice analogy, and that is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. What we saw there were rules being put in place to make sure that accidents, one, didn't happen, or that there was a safe and responsible use around the idea of mutually assured destruction, to make sure that we were able to manage the issue writ large and then only deal with the bits that we actually have some control over. And I think for something like AI, that is going to be an ongoing conversation about what are the bits that we actually care about. And I think there's three questions that I hope we can get to some, not an answer, but at least some exploration of today. I think for digital data and digital, this has been a conversation that's been happening for decades. When I came into the public service, we talked about data and digital challenges. They just happened to have changed, and the technology happened to have changed. I think there's three key questions that are worth us thinking about. The first one, how can regulators use technology to improve the efficacy of the regulations they already have? That's an important one. So I think regulators on the line, and when you engage with the regulators, the thing they're most interested in is how can we use these technologies to get better outcomes under our role? I think the second one is, how does technology like AI influence what we're regulating? So that is, if we are regulating the financial sector, for example, how might artificial intelligence change the market, or how might it affect how entities and regulated entities are engaging in the market? I think the third one is, how does this change our policy settings? So there is obviously a through line between what a regulator might be required to regulate, but the origins of that come from apps. The question is, how are we ensuring that regulators and policy entities are responding to these challenges in a way that allows the regulators to both respond to shocks, but also use these technologies to get better regulated outcomes? But I think the key question here is, what do we actually think is going to happen? And I think this is a question of regulating under extreme uncertainty. Some of it we don't know, but what are the no regrets things that we can do whole of government, in cooperation with other countries, in cooperation across jurisdictions, to ensure that the worst case scenario doesn't happen, and that we're really only focusing on the marginal difference? So what are the things that we can control? And I think all of these things come down to distilling all of these questions into nice compartments to try and deal with, but also grasp and grapple the things that we don't actually have control of. And I think knowing that is a really, really important part of this conversation.
It's a good place to start, and let's just keep the conversation going between the two of you at the moment, and then we'll give people, I hope, time to both warm up and pick up some of the themes. So please feel free to start barreling either questions or comments or reflections. We'll keep an eye on the Q&A. But Kate, I'll go back to you. I mean, those three questions are pretty substantive. You started unpacking at least some of them in that way, but I think Josh was given a very nice framework. But I wonder whether we might just get, for the moment, I'd quite like to get to the policy stuff, because I do think that's quite an important issue, because I think often for many people, it's the forgotten bit of this conversation. Everyone's so rapidly thinking, so what's the new tool? What's the new reg? You know, what are we going to do to stop this stuff or whatever? We don't think about what I would call the sort of regulatory hinterland. We were talking about this just a bit earlier. But Kate, coming back, you know, what is it about these tools and technologies that could help regulators who are doing the job right now do their job better? Like, let's start there. Where would you
let's start there. I'll just use a concrete example to try
Please.
and demonstrate the sort of effect that we could have.
Great.
Sorry, I keep tooting this RAS gateway thing, but I'm just going to use it as an example because I have that experience.
Yeah.
When we were building it, we spoke to a lot of stakeholders about what they wanted to see in the regulation of autonomous systems in the future. And we had a lot of academics, and people have big brains, and there was lots of cool, groovy ideas about the future of regulation, and like safety of the service, and we were going to have drones, and they were going to be pinging CASA, letting them know, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe, as it cruised along the skies. Traffic management, super advanced. We actually did a sort of discovery of stakeholders' needs. The thing that came out most strongly was like, that's all great, but right now I would like some information. There was no information online about what the existing regulations were as they pertain to autonomous systems in Australia. There was no online place free to the public that wasn't academic, wasn't a government production of formal stuff in a sense, but was trustworthy. So to be trustworthy information that was useful to stakeholders, the regulated, and it turned out the regulator. So when we were building RAS Gateway, we kind of was a bit biased towards the regulated so that they would be able to prepare their safety cases for the regulators so that the regulators could connect, because the relationship between the two parties was almost Victorian. It was like so hard to get a person inside the regulatory environment who would spend the time with you because you needed your hand held because you had something innovative going on. There were not many of them around. So it was all relationship based, very Victorian. You couldn't just be some outsider, and you had to be a big company to afford your own regulatory apparatus to prepare all the safety cases and everything else. There's a whole economy in ignorance. So we were trying to democratize information in the first instance, which doesn't sound very sexy and isn't a cool tool and isn't an amazing app. But by putting that information online, we help democratize access to regulatory information. Now, how do we use AI? I'm coming to that. So now we've got this information out there. What do we know AI is not too bad at, or at least provides potentially some advantage, is moving through information. So you can actually grab some information now that's on RAS Gateway with an LLM, and you can actually probably get to a potential answer more quickly than if you just had to move through that information manually, or just with traditional search functions like PDF search, which of course did accelerate things as well. You would have to make sure you then went back and verified what you found. But if you're inside the regulatory, if you're a regulator and you've been put into a position where you need to now provide regulatory advice on autonomous vessels or something, and you don't have a background in it, which often happens in the public service, people come in and take open roles, you can quickly professionally upskill in the regulations pertinent to provide service to customers and potentially accelerating that communication and that relationship with others and disseminating that more broadly inside the organisation with the tight resourcing that exists inside the regulators. So I think that's just a concrete example of using AI right now, using existing tools and existing data sets.
And the obvious implication, Joshua, I'm going to come back to you in a sense to start answering your very first question, which is the one that I think is well worth. But at that point, it says, okay, if you're a regulator, you are not going to be able to ignore this stuff. You are going to have to go out and work out how you use an LLM, how to use it safely. You're going to have to go and practice. So someone said to me the other day, this is actually stuff that by and large, you can't really be taught. You've just got to go and start using it and you'll soon find out. So Joshua, is that like a sensible starting point to your very first question? Like, what is it we're going to ask regulators to do right now?
Yeah, look, I think so. And I do think it's a really good question. So just to the issue of AI, and I think AI is the one that in front of everyone.
It's a little dominant at the moment, no doubt about that.
It is a bit dominant. And I might dispel some of that dominance because I think we tend to think about AI as this new fancy thing. It really isn't, aside from the fact that it computationally can do more and it can do it more quickly and it can pull in from a lot of information. These are things that regulators are already doing, albeit in a more time-intensive way. So going back to the point I made around uncertainty, I think there is a big opportunity that regulators can harness to try and draw linkages between dynamics that might need to be thought about. And I think about things like biosecurity, for example. If you can reduce, even at the margin, a degree of the uncertainty of the environment that you're regulating in just by having more computational power or being able to draw linkages between information sets that you couldn't before or would be time intensive, that can have an enormous effect on what you are regulating and whether you are having efficacy outcomes from that regulation. So I think at the margin, AI does make a difference, but it is going to depend on the data that you've got, your ability to use data sets across agencies, the ability for people internally to use these data sets. But I think AI is a slight misnomer. I think it is going to affect things. I think probably the jury's still out on to what extent.
Ooh, can I be controversial back again? Can I just
please.
Just for fun, just to keep us lively, not that we're not pretty lively. I hear this quite a lot, like AI is not new, it's pretty much the same sort of thing. And I do agree with some component of that, but I do think it is important we recognise how foundationally different the current moment is in the cognitive role of AI right now.
What do you mean by that?
So a big part of the risk for the public service and government decision making, in my view, with the use of LLMs in particular, is that it's going to potentially erode the cognitive relationship public servants and the government has with the public.
Okay.
And we don't yet really understand what that means. Now, what do I mean by that? So there's a great article by the famous Micah Ensley in Human Factors called The Ironies of Artificial Intelligence. And she wrote that as a follow-on from another famous article in the 1980s, which was The Ironies of Automation. And the ironies of automation in the 1980s was all about things like losing skills, so that if you adopt automatic systems and you're no longer actively utilizing them all the time, you get atrophy, or you get automation bias. And so in mining automated systems and in aircraft automated systems, you know, pilots don't get as much time actually taking off and learning how to land. They spend most of their energies not doing the same amount of behaviors and practice in a lot of ways. So they're not very good if you take those features away. So that's been known about for a really, really, really long time. And of course, it applies to AI now as well. But with this particular version of AI that is cognitive. So what it does is it talks to you, and it actually makes us feel like this thing understands us, and it's quite implicit, and it actually reduces our guardrails. It actually, the mechanisms we have to be skeptical, to doubt, and to ask questions, to say, does this really know what it's talking about? It actually is reduced. Even when you consciously want to not have it reduced, it does anyway, and it stops us having high order thinking. So I, for example, have received LLM outputs from a paper or a piece of legislation that seems on first glance pretty good. But if you actually start going through it by word, you'll find the LLM's done things like replace the word framework with the word standard. Well, that might be fine, but it isn't with government. Okay.
2 different words, as it turns out.
They're actually really different things. But the LLM has it does not care if those are different things. And so it'll write you a very seemingly okay thing, which is so dangerous. It's so dangerous for everyone. It's dangerous for professionals who have done law degrees and actually know what the legislation says, because now anybody is sending legally sounding stuff around.
Yes.
And balloons. And
I think that's a good thing.
The erosion of our abilities to keep epistemically safe is really dangerous. And that is nothing to do with security, privacy, powerful corporations, any of that. It actually, the whole nature of human relationships is sort of at risk.
Josh, come in.
Look, I think I fundamentally agree. I think you've touched on an interesting point. It's something that I've raised a few times with colleagues, is that if I were to develop an economic model that draws a linkage between two variables, I understand exactly how that works. I understand the statistical significance of that linkage. I understand the situation and the constraints on that relationship. I think you're right. I think one of the challenges we've got is, how do you maintain, and dare I say, academic rigor around these things, where you might actually end up with outputs that people don't fundamentally understand. I think that's a broader question around, do people, have we de-skilled already with existing automation? But I do think you're right, when it comes to something like AI, which can at scale do these linkages faster and easier, are you de-skilling the very people that should be upskilling to get these outcomes?
This is kind of, there's a hand up before I go any further. I think I got a message. Did I, from Anna? Is that right, Anna? Do you want to come off mute and just quickly chip in? I think I hope I saw that flag properly. I thought it said Anna had a hand up. I might have just made that up. No? Okay, cool. I just didn't, it's just very hard to see 238 people all in one go. So if that's happening, please flap that flag or whatever it is that you need to flap to make sure that you don't miss the chance. We are going to open the lines a little bit later, and there's already a couple of questions, including one around the misalignment of timing to some extent between the way. We'll come back to that in a minute because it's a policy question. But here's an interesting observation you guys are both making, which is that the very moment when we would think that this is a bunch of tools and techniques that are going to help public servants and civil servants around the world do exactly the things they're supposed to be doing better of, more of. So expertise, precision, speed, reliability, like all the things that make you a good, we're saying, this tool looks as if it's going to help you do all of those things, but actually, if you're not careful, it actually might make you do all of those things less well than you were. Now, that's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? When the pressure is go and grab these tools, see what they can do for you. And yet at the same time, you're both warning to some extent, and I'm going to ask you to take that a bit further, that these might be gifts that you need to be a little careful accepting, or at least how you begin to accept them. Am I overdoing your comment? It seems to me it's a really powerful one.
I mean, look, I want to use these tools, and there are places for
They're
them.
fun, aren't they, right? They really
They're
are quite good fun. Yes.
But and I gave it all a whirl. For example, here's a classic productivity advantage you might hope for. Take a transcript from a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting and use an internal and safe government generative AI tool. So in Queensland government, we have QChat.
Yes, you got your own. Yes, I heard that. Yeah.
Which allows us to explore what we can do, but it's through Microsoft Azure, and it doesn't work by taking our SharePoint data and mucking around with it like Copilot, which we don't trust at the moment anyway. Most of us a bit worried. So we've got QChat, great. I'm like, all right, I'm going to track this meeting transcript, pop it into QChat, and ask for a meeting summary, meeting minutes, because surely like that's what Microsoft is telling us, fabulous to do this. Well, okay, I want to do it then. Yikes. Look at the minutes. What's missing? All the politics. What's the point of minutes anyway? Okay.
Yeah.
What you want is individual people's perception of what's important, their argument for those things, how that's affected the actions, so that if any of us are required to justify our decision making in government according to our records obligations, that you can actually follow the rational line of argument. The generative AI minutes does the work, and it will deceive every stakeholder with regards to what it means. And it comes through like a kind of corporate American blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It is not specific. And so I will not use a generative AI product to do meeting minutes. Okay, can I get any other advantage? Well, I have found it's not too bad to take a chunk of a transcript, like a little paragraph from something somebody said that's in that weird transcript ease, which is not easy to put into a formal document. And I can take a little paragraph, couple of sentences, and I can get that to sound like a real paragraph from a transcript. And then I listen to the tape, I'm writing myself, making changes. And I do think I could get minutes that have, instead of it sounding like a transcript, it sounds more like written prose. I don't know if that has saved me a single second. I think that means that I have some pretty cool looking minutes that are fairly like a document, more so than you might get in a traditional meeting where you are a bit scrappy. And if that's important to anyone, then great.
Yeah.
But it's not saving a lot of time. It might be improving my reputation if I do it with the level of diligence I sort of have to do for my own reputation. Like, I'm stuffed. I'm never going to be employed if I lean on these tools for what they say is the best thing to use them for.
Okay, let me just take that a stage further. We're getting some interesting, there are little hearts going up and down and little thumbs up signs. It's very not, the screen is coming alive, which I hope is a good sign. We also have a couple of questions, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, very specifically. So that's good. Please keep those questions coming on, because very shortly we'll kind of very much go back into the space to make sure we're covering the issues that you want to cover. Let me just take an analogy. I know today, because I've been talking to him in another context. David Hazelhurst at Services Australia did a video meeting with his staff. And he said, what we're going to do with AI is we're going to be deliberately, we're not going to deliberately take a position of leading edge experimentation. We're going to be a deliberate, if you like, sort of slow and steady follower. And we're going to be quite modest. He said, this is all in the public domain now, I know, because they double checked that he's already had this meeting this morning with his all 30,000 staff across Services Australia. But the basic proposition is, yes, there are things that we can expect these tools to do for you. Things like, might help you with some analysis. It might help you do some community engagement. There's a question in the chat already. Is this a good way of AI helping you to get a really good handle on community sentiment? Because it can just parse just so much more data than you could ever possibly do. If you had 500 submissions to a consultation, what are you going to do with that? Well, AI can help you begin to digest that. Is that where we need to go in the public service a little bit? Let's be sensible. Let's be steady. Let's not shy away from it, but let's start to learn our way. Joshua, sorry, I hope that wasn't too familiar, but is that where you'd go with that? Is David right? Let's be kind of cautious, but steady and intelligent about how we get into this space. Is that where we're heading?
Look, I think so. And I think it's contingent on two things. One is that, and you hear this talked about all the time, and you see all these numbers in the public domain about how much of an economic impact AI is going to have. I think the people misunderstand, the thing people misunderstand about productivity gains is it is going to be contingent on the use that these people and resources are redeployed to. So I think that's point one. I think the second point here is around testing. And this is where I think scientific rigor comes into it. And that is designing methodologies that allow you to test and repeat AI or whatever it is, using different data sets, using different scenarios, different prompts to understand, one, where are the risks? So what are the things that could go wrong? And for those, you might want to use some very constrained control groups. But the key here is going to be a methodology by which we can determine, well, hang on, the proof for a regulator, the proof in the is in the pudding on have I actually been able to litigate an issue, for example, using AI outputs. And the jury's still out, but we should all have in the back of our minds about, so we can use it and develop something nice and shiny. How does it change the outcome? It's not necessarily about, did I do that particular step differently or quicker? It's actually about what's the outcome. And I think one thing we know about technology, and we saw it with computers, we've seen it a whole stack of times throughout human history, it diffuses differently in different sectors. And really the benefits of this are going to be in the areas that it diffuses to and how they use it. And I think government is a prime example of really needing to make sure there is rigor behind this to make sure that it is able to actually do the job that it's been assigned to do.
Yeah. Kate, let me take a question from the Q&A, which I think is a really important one. Again, a bunch of regulators, there's a lot of them on this call. So the question is, okay, I'm just getting myself around things like basic data analytics. I'm using digital engagement, perhaps with some of my regulated entities. Like, do I keep going with that? Or do I chuck all that away and say, oh, no, it's all about AI now. I'm going to have to go and learn these new ones. Forget all those sort of legacy capabilities. Like, what's your advice to a regulator saying, oh, does this mean I really ought to be putting all my, my nascent digital skills, which I've learned, say, in the last 5 years, and now this thing has come over the top. What's your advice about where they should go?
Yeah, so I think there's a huge conversation on data analytics and methodologies. One of the biggest gaps we have in Australia is good data.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, it's a massive, massive gap, right? So we're using these AI tools. As Joshua said, we're a medium sort of nation. We can't afford to invest in AI tools the same scale as the larger economies. So we are sort of going to be always dependent on these other products that have all been trained on data that's pretty much not about us. So there is a serious national sovereignty question here. If you look at the history of Australia and the history of trying to nation build and the development of cultural organisations like the ABC, National Archives, things to try and national film boards. People are like, why do we need to invest in Australian films? Well, it's incredibly important. If you think that your culture and your way of telling stories needs to be preserved and disseminated to children and so forth. There are 10,000 languages in the world. There are hundreds of Indigenous Australian languages. They don't have representation in the digital form. So when we think about data and we think about AI, we've got to think about the poverty of Australian data in any of the AI systems that we have access to. So if we want to replicate American corporate speak, great. If that's the job we've got, we can use the tool for that kind of function. We need to be much more aggressive, in my view, about getting better Australian data and then finding the right relationships between the data owners and data subjects and government use of that data. And it isn't very sexy. So the data governance frameworks and the Indigenous data governance frameworks.
Yeah, the sovereignty stuff.
They don't get the time and air that the AI conversation does. But if you look at, well, what's AI look like that's good for Indigenous cultures? Should we be spending $40 million on co-pilot licenses, for example, or should we spend $40 million on getting better data relationships with rural, remote, marginalized and vulnerable communities? I mean, one of the loveliest things I've ever done was to be able to progress 2 Indigenous AI projects in Queensland, one with the Palmer Language Centre working on transfer learning with 200 Cape York languages using machine learning, and the other equipping Indigenous rangers to fly drones using autonomous technologies to perceive Aboriginal rock art, to classify it according to Indigenous data structures, and to empower those communities to use drones, AI, data governance, management, and to own their data, and then to have the relationship to their own work and culture. That's very, now what was that? That was overall, it was $1.5 million, which is a huge amount of money, let me tell you, for some of these places, right? Huge.
Yeah, of course.
Okay?
Yeah,
But this is an absolute thimble. So when I see national government and state governments, and they're like, we're going to spend $40 million on Microsoft, I say, why not spend $40 million on data and information structures that would forge our own relationship with AI, that would preserve our national culture and identity and push us further as a nation.
Yeah.
So I'm very passionate about not losing sight the valuable work in data analytics that actually helps our people. Because otherwise we dissolve as a nation.
I can see the reactions on the screen suggest you might have hit a nerve here, but I'm going to use this as an excuse to dive a little bit deeper into this kind of the hinterland question. And Joshua, I'm going to come to you. There's a few comments on this. By the way, a couple of very strong comments on the chat or the Q&A, really reinforcing your point, I think, Kate, about the core, the foundational issues around quality of Australian data. So I think you're, as I say, you're hitting a nerve, and an important one. But from a policy point of view, that does raise some interesting questions. And I wonder, Joshua, where you would take us. I think was your third question, actually, about, how does all of this actually challenge the policy frameworks we work in? There was a comment in the Q&A about, so we still haven't got the regulatory AI on the AI front. We're still waiting for the kind of, I think it's going to be promulgated more likely in September, as I understand it. There's going to be some more announcements, but we've had the consultation. So do regulators kind of have to make some of this framework up themselves and sort of then comply with it? Like, how do we go take that as one issue? The other issue that came up early in the Q&A, which I think is an important one, and I was going to raise it myself, so it's a good way to segue into that, is this issue about the mismatch between the rhythm and intensity with which these technologies evolve and the rhythm and intensity of the way in which governments and regulation responds, which is never, that's been true for ever since we've had regulation and technology. It's always out of step. But if you're a regulator, that can feel pretty uncomfortable, right? That you feel that you're being squashed between these sort of two time frames, if you like, and how do you hold those two together? Sorry, that's quite a long ramble, but I wonder if you'd like to take us a little bit into that sort of policy context that you raised a bit earlier.
Yeah, look, they're very big questions. I think in terms of the one point I'll make, and it sort of goes to what Kate was saying before I sort of go into the question more broadly. I think one of the challenges we've got is that there are financial constraints on regulators. These are real. We can't pretend they're not constrained. And that is really going to affect the ability for regulators to invest in the things that would improve the outcomes. I think that is a thing that we can't pretend hasn't happened and is not happening. It certainly is. And I think that does two things. I think that really does mean that some regulators are going to be behind others, which is okay. I don't think there is a standard story but behind how a regulator might take up AI. I think it is going to differ on the regulator themselves. But the two questions here are, and I'll get to the second one in a second, Martin. The first one is the funding there, and are there incentives there to ensure, one, that regulators are funded to be able to do these things, and that there are mechanisms to ensure that they're able to be funded for these things. Second question is, do they have access to the skills that they need? And that is just in the context of the thing I outlined right at the start. Australia is in a global skills market. Cybersecurity skills alone and the shortage
I keep reading.
In the United States market is bigger than the next 5 countries combined. So we are going to have an enormous skills gap. We can't necessarily rely on the importation of these skills. So some of it is going to have to be investing in our own people and the people who are the experts in the policy areas so far. So there is a story here about investment in regulators to ensure they are fit for purpose. The second question is around the linkage between the policy and the regulation. And I think what we can perhaps get better at, and Kate's point around Australia being, we tend to look at the UK and Canada or whoever and say, well, how can we replicate that? I think we're very unfair on ourselves. And whenever someone asks, what is the UK doing? My first question is, does it matter?
Who cares? No,
question.
couldn't say that.
Australia is and can be at the forefront of these regulations. We have incredibly talented workforce. We have excellent regulators. We have good public services. We have very strong institutions. My question is, why can we not be at the forefront of these issues? And I think what we really need to establish is a link between the regulators who are on the ground and understand what's going on, understand the dynamics that are changing the world. And AI is it's just another technology. The problem is it proliferates very quickly and can cause very big problems very quickly, particularly around market power. And you mentioned sovereignty there, Kate. I think one of the biggest problems is that the private sector just has better data than us writ large, which means they are able to skew the market very quickly, and it causes all sorts of problems for us. But I think the fundamental question is, what are the mechanisms by which regulators are able to talk to portfolio agents and say, this is a problem. This is something we really need to be addressing. What we're seeing on the ground are these things. And we have some institutions that are very good at that. The ACCC, for example, in my view, is excellent at responding to these things.
Okay.
The ACMA is another one that I think is excellent. Border Force, a lot of these regulators are very good at communicating it. The question is, how can we become better and more efficient at it so that decision makers are able to say, is this something we need to address through new legislation or through guidance on things like the use of AI?
Right.
And I think the fundamental question here is, how do we improve the line of sight between a regulator and the policy frameworks? Because regulators can only be as good as the regulations that they're enforcing.
Indeed, and the policy framework. That's a very stirring and that's a wonderful exposition. I want to take it a stage further and get very crunchy at this point, pick up a question from the chat, sorry, the Q&A, and come back to you, Kate. So let's say we've got a bunch of regulators say, yes, we get that. We want to barrel down this path. Okay, we've got to sit down, slightly risk-averse government at the moment, slightly difficult. How do I write the business case? Like, what am I going to write to the government to say, give me the money, give me the resources? Is it just, what's the story here? Convenience, productivity, better relationship with our customers? Like, where would you go if you're the business case writer saying, yeah, we get everything that Joshua just said. That's terrific. You guys have got it right on the money. We're going to go down the road. Oh, no, where do I start? Where would you start, Kate?
And can I just confirm that this is with relation to spending our money on better data and better connection to community rather than just buying the next AI tool? Is that the conversation I'm in?
Yeah, to some extent. It's really, but it's even more basic. Yeah, where would you go to get going, to get permission to get moving into the space?
Okay, where would I get going to get permission to get going in this space?
That's a beautifully modulated question.
It's great. So I'm sure all regulators, like most government departments, will have had staff surveys or stakeholder data that talks about the things that they wish that organisation would do better or differently. And then you write your business case around the use of AI that picks up on a place where you feel like the product would assist in that particular issue. And this issue of, you know, the gap for regulators between them and everybody else is massive. They're like they know everything about their regulation. They are the fount of all knowledge. They are the ones to trust.
By definition.
And they're dealing with 99.98% of the rest of the population who knows close to zero about the thing for which they know almost everything about.
Yeah.
And I think a huge advantage in productivity for regulators is the degree to which other people, that 99.98% who don't know anything about regulation, to enable the other stakeholders who need to be more compliant with regulation, need to move more in a more sophisticated fashion through. If we can help connect those stakeholders with better ways of understanding regulation that's more connected to them. And in that regard, it's about starting conversations and equipping background knowledge in those who are not experts in regulations. You're never using the AI to make regulatory decisions or making usually administrative decisions that have legal consequences. But you can massively upskill people to have a better conversation. And I find that, you know, I don't know the ins and outs of the various kinds of regulation in the Queensland government that might be relevant to making adjudication on use of AI. And we talk across 14 different risk domains in the Queensland government, from, you know, the Attorney General's Department, think about human rights, you know, the public sector, that's, considering public sector values and the Public Sector Ethics Act in Queensland. Then you've got security, you've got privacy, information commission, you've got the ombudsman, you've got crime and corruption. You've got a lot of different domains in Queensland government, and they each have legislation that they have to comply with, and none of them know anything much about anybody else.
Yeah.
But you can feed AI documents, and this is where somebody made a comment about, can I put official information into these public
Yeah, I saw that comment in the
AI products? So yeah, no, don't do that. Definitely try to get a tool inside your departments that is able to use those APIs.
Walled garden,
But have a walled garden where you can put that official information inside. So do seek that. It's not that expensive to fund an internal tool, because it can be clipped together quite quickly these days. Don't put official information in those public tools. But guess what? Almost all our legislation is public. So you can ask an LLM to have a conversation with you about a piece of legislation and about some other part of legislation you would not normally have the time in your day to think about.
Yeah.
And that can furnish your conversation with an expert that helps them feel like you have a basic interest in understanding them a bit better.
We're going to take a couple more questions. We are, as always, when you have an hour, it's amazing how an hour clicks down and we're sort of 10 minutes out. I do want both of you to have an opportunity, and I'll sort of set this up now, to think a little bit about what perhaps you might be prepared to, I was going to say predict, that's a big word, but what you might think might be happening in the next year or two in this conversation around how the regulatory function is going to engage many of the issues. So you might want to think now about perhaps a year or two ahead, what would you expect to see? Or perhaps you could say, what would we hope to see? I mean, there is a very big, there's a very big question in the chat about, so what are we going to do about in the future to regulate and manage AI? I don't know whether either of you got any just general thoughts about ways in which we're going to go down there. But Joshua, let me start with you for a couple of moments and then come back to Kate on that one. That is a big question, clearly, and somewhat at the forefront of everyone's mind.
About how we regulate AI.
Yeah, how are we going to, regulate and manage it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government is doing an excellent job about trying to understand that issue, and it's systematically working through what are the bits that we need to be involved in, what are the bits that we don't, what are the bits that we can rely on existing legislation, and what are the bits that can't. And that's something that the current government is working through DISA. But the one thing I'll say is, and I would sort of touch on this in the final comments too, what I really want to see more of is and understand. I think we rely on regulators a lot to deal with things that don't necessarily need to be dealt with if the policy or posture settings are better. So this is particularly the case in national security, where we're having to deal with issues around AI, mainly because we're not engaging in the link between domestic and international policy. So we're not using the tools available to us to understand, well, what's actually happening and how can we reduce overall risk? And I think what that's meaning is that instead of dealing with the tail risk, we're sort of wedging ourselves into a corner solution where we're trying to solve absolutely everything through regulation, rather than engaging and saying, how can the market, or how can engagement in the region, or how can engagement with other countries or other regulators improve our position on AI, rather than having to say, we are going to deal with everything domestically, with massive problems with that in and of itself. The question should be, how can we use our existing relationships? And I guess, what are the opportunities for Australia to take leadership with ASEAN, for example, to help codify some of these things that we think are important, build a common market understanding and common values on things that we want to derive from AI regulation. And I think that is the key thing, and I think that's the key thing that's missing. How do we use these existing relationships to make the market resilient by default? So we're not dealing with everything, we're reducing the amount we have to deal with because we're being smarter ex ante.
I like it. Kate, any quick reflections on that? It is a terribly big question for the end of an hour like this.
It is a big question. I'm just going to use a little case study just to illustrate these good points from Joshua. So I think the digital realm does present a different governance conversation. And watching the UN CCW lethal autonomous systems debate over the last 10 years, everyone agrees that we don't want uncontrollable killer robots rampaging over the battlefield and in our lives. That's scary. We don't want that. In the attempt to regulate this functionality, it has been extremely difficult to put the finger on the thing. In nuclear, at least nuclear weapons have stuff. They've got uranium, and the entire apparatus of the Cold War regulatory environment was about monitoring for radioactive signals in the environment and being able to detect decay and particles and so forth. The ability for us to ban, using poisonous gases and other things in the international domain is because we can point to it and say that thing, that substance is the thing we get rid of, and then you can try to regulate supply chains and so forth. We can see the commercial off-the-shelf use of drones and artificial intelligence in conflicts around the world, Ukraine, and then the export of those functionalities to other places like in Burma. There is a very difficult thing to point the finger at the thing you're going to ban, because we need those drones for surf rescue or for firefighting as well. So that's the reality. The good thing is there are so many existing regulations that we can try to firm up or adapt to be more powerful. And so compliance with our existing laws around human rights and existing laws around privacy in the context of these technologies is where a lot of our energy can go. And it's not very sexy, just like it's not very sexy to look after data properly and actually keep your data hygiene away. But those are the enablers of good AI, and the good use of artificial intelligence in international affairs depends on culture, international dialogues, and expectations of behavior to control what nations do, and for there to be that traceability around behaviors. Because when you look under the hood, when you try to find in the drone, look inside the silicon chips, you're not going to find the rules and instructions that told that drone whether it could autonomously do a thing that you don't approve of. That's going to be the black box there. And so instead we have to have mechanisms to govern that may go to a different place in regulation.
A fundamentally different game, isn't it? That's really powerful. We are going to have to draw this conversation to an end, not because we finished, but because we barely started, but we've done it in a very powerful way. I want to thank you both, and I will give you both a couple of minutes now to just think a little bit before we do some summing up, and also a couple of very important forward commitments from the regulators community of practice that will take many of these conversations, one of which is, in fact, has a very important First Nations element to it. So I want to get that in before we finish. But just both of you, literally for a minute or two, if we were looking ahead now for a year or two, perhaps you could do it either way. What would you expect to be happening in this conversation? Or perhaps you might both want to say, what would you like to see happening? I think it's implicit in much of what you've said. Brilliant exposition, I think, and you've really riffed us very nicely off these issues. But Joshua, let me come to you first of all. What might you expect in the next year or two? Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves.
Look, I think one of them is actually something that enables the regulators. So I think we rely a lot on the regulators at the front line to do the bidding of the rest of the policy continuum. One of the things I would like to see more of, and it goes down to the question of how do you help a regulator build a business case? And I think there are areas that do this. So things like biosecurity are so powerful because we know what the cost of an incursion is. So I think the question isn't necessarily, well, how do we regulate it? I think the question has to be, what happens if we don't regulate it? And then from there, you can start talking about, well, what's the best way to influence those regulatory outcomes? It turns out regulation will be a very small part of a bigger picture, but getting a better understanding of that conversation will, just by virtue of having the conversation, lead to better outcomes.
Super. Kate, where would you think we might be heading, or would like to head in the next year or two? As I say, not too ambitious in our future look, but what would be on the table?
I think we should be confident. Australia has had a national AI ethics framework since 2019. That framework is not regulation, it's not mandatory, but it's been fed. Okay, it's been fed. So now we saw in 2023 about 10 different government documents, whether it was the Commonwealth Ombudsman's Automated Decision-Making Best Practice Guide or CSIRO's Implementing Australia's AI Ethics Principles document. There's the framework's been fed, and now in the National AI Assurance framework that all jurisdictions in Australia have signed on to, it allows a lot of flexibility, but a way of having a conversation together. This, for me, in the next couple of years, we're going to see a bedding down of some shared approaches to AI risk across all sectors that we can benefit from, and the literacy across all employees is going to increase, and we're going to start to see a better relationship between opportunity and risk that makes us feel safer to innovate and try to see how we can move forward as a population, and hopefully with enough mindfulness that we don't sink into like an American corporate language black hole.
Right. Terrific. Look, I'm going to wrap at this point. I've got a couple of quick announcements I want to make, and then a quick thank you before we finish. First of all, terrific conversation, absolutely wonderful, and exactly, I think, where we needed to go. So thank you very much for that. Regular participants in the community practice will know there'll be a short evaluation survey shortly, so please give us some response on that. There's also an opening for the registrations are now going to be open for the Professional Regulator Professional Development Program, NRCoP, and the RegNet team at ANU. So there's currently a survey open, so please do get involved with that. The next hybrid event with NRCoP is very important, and it's titled Meet the Regulators, Supporting First Nations Australians to Build Strong, Equitable and Sustainable Communities, in Darwin on the 27th of August. So we are on the money. And I think you've opened up a very, very powerful part of this conversation. So thank you very much for that. Keep, as always, on the social media page, LinkedIn for NRCoP and all the rest of it. So you can make sure that you keep a track of all of this. But from my perspective, can I thank both of you very much for the energy and insight. And I think, if I might say so, the thoughtfulness about a conversation that just needs a little bit more thought at the moment. That sense that there's a bigger set of conversations, to take Kate's word of the day, not all that sexy very often, but astonishingly powerful if we want to get some of these front-end considerations about the relationship between regulation and technology right. So I think you've set exactly the right tone. The screen is going off with explosions of claps and hearts and thumbs up, and I'm making the assumption, as one has to in this virtual world, exactly, that you
trying to get the balloons.
You've hit some kind of nerve here. You've hit some kind of nerve. Everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. We're 1 minute over, but at this point, have a wonderful rest of the Monday. Thanks so much indeed.